So last Sunday we started this new series called Jesus Greater Than, and for those of you that have been around, you know that we teach in series here, so we'll take a particular idea or topic or theme, and we'll just sit in that for about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, sometimes up to 6 weeks, and hopefully they all tie together and they all make sense together as a full series. And last week as we launched this new series, the word was really approval. We talked a lot about approval, the ways that we seek approval from people in life, and the way that we seek even our self-worth in life. And we really talked about how Jesus is greater than religion, because religion always gives us a chance or tells us that what we have to do is to earn approval and access to the divine, to God, through our action, that it's up to us. We have to do the right things. And the truth is that Jesus has given us full approval and full access to the divine through his action. It's not our action, it's his action. And this week there's going to be some overlap with that theme of approval, and especially when we consider that religion tells us that we are approved if we act a certain way, speak a certain way, look a certain way, as opposed to Jesus, who says you're actually approved through my work and my action. All you have to do is receive it. Whatever you look like, sound like, act like right now in this moment. And so this week as we head on to another word, there'll be some overlap with that. But this week we're really going to talk about control. The idea of control. How is Jesus greater than control for us? I love to get out in the community when I'm working. So as opposed to coming here to the campus most days and sitting in an office by myself, I love to go different places. I'll go work at different coffee shops, or I'll go work in different restaurants. And for me, there's just a lot of benefit to that. I get to see people that I wouldn't normally get to see because today you don't have a lot of people coming by the church, during the week. So instead I get out and get to see people. Sometimes I'll see people who I haven't seen in a while and get to catch up with them. Get to see what's going on in their lives and share a little bit about what's going on here at the church or in my life. And a lot of times I get to meet people because sometimes I'll see somebody who's having lunch or coffee or breakfast with a coworker or another associate or a family member, and they get to introduce me to that person. So I get to meet new people that way when I'm out in the community as opposed to being here. And there's also just an added benefit. I do work better when there's a little bit of business going on around me. When there's some hustle and bustle and people are coming and going, I just tend to be more productive than when I'm in a place of solitude. The library is a great place to go to. A lot of times I'll go to the library and get some work done there with other people. But the added benefit, and I promise you that this is not the motivation, this is not one of the reasons why I like to go and work out in other places as opposed to the church, is because occasionally there'll be some people around me who'll be having a conversation. And I'll get to kind of tune in to that conversation. And it provides fantastic material for my messages. And so really, on a serious level, it really gives me an opportunity to understand what people are dealing with. Because when you hear people's conversations and you hear what they're struggling with, that probably, as number one would be, my reading of the Bible, which is what informs messages. But number two to that is really what's going on in people's lives and what they're struggling with and what's on their minds and what's on their hearts. And so this past week I was out at a restaurant getting some work done at a table, and just behind me, the managers of this particular restaurant were sitting, and they were having a conversation about the other employees at the restaurant. And so I kind of, pretended like I was working. Don't judge me. Okay, they knew I was there. They could see me. They were open with their conversation. But they were talking about particular employees and how many piercings these employees had, and tattoos, and the color of their hair, and the length of their hair, and what they were wearing. And clearly company policy and store policy states. And it was interesting to hear their conversation because they were struggling with this tension of, we can either really enforce company policy and store policy as it's handed down from on high, and I'm not talking about heaven, I'm talking about corporate, We can either enforce it as it's handed down, or we can retain the very talented and very capable people that we have working for us. Because if we strictly enforce this policy, chances are we're probably going to lose some of these people, and they're great workers, and they have great personalities, and they serve people well, and they're fantastic at their job. And so there was a real tension, and they decided that at this particular location, and I'm not going to name their names, where I was listening in, because they didn't offer me any free things, if I would name them, but that's not out of the question, But ultimately, they decided that they were going to tweak some of their policy, and they were going to allow grace with some of that, which was handed down in their handbook, in order to retain some of the talent and some of the people who they are in relationship with, and they were not going to allow the rules to control who it is that was working at this particular restaurant. And I was thinking, how excited do we get about corporate policy? Is it just me? Like, don't you just love a good handbook? Don't you love a good employee handbook? I mean, I know I study mine regularly, on a regular basis, just as a refresher, and I'm sure many of you who are in jobs and positions at work where there's a handbook, you go and you have a manager, and the manager's job is to make sure that you adhere to company policy and to the handbook. And when they come around to check on you and make sure that you're doing everything according to the way that it's been laid out in the handbook, you get so excited, and you're like, yes, this is the reason why I took this job in the first place, right? I mean, I'm not the only one, right? I see. Yeah, y'all understand. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just, to make sure that, you get those emails and they say change in company policy, and you're just so excited to click it and open it up and see what change it's going to bring. And you open it up, and it's, from a boss who you know their name, but you've never really seen their face. And it says, make sure that you use the updated covers on your TPS reports. How many of you got that reference? Thank you. Y'all my people who got that reference there. If you didn't get it, you can Google it or ask somebody later. But of course, none of us find life in that. All of the corporate culture and people making rules and handing out policy are all about control. It's all about trying to control people. It's all about trying to control a large group of people to maintain a particular standard within a company or an organization or a business. And although sometimes it may be necessary, it never lights anybody's fire. Nobody gets excited about new company policy or store policy. Nobody gets excited about the new rules that are being used for the sake of controlling and modifying our behavior as an employee. And so there's this idea of control, right? It's about control. There's something about control that squeezes us when we're experiencing it. When someone else is trying to control us, we feel squeezed, and we kind of want to run the opposite direction. And so it's not only being controlled, but sometimes our lives feel out of control. Sometimes our lives feel completely out of control. For many of us, we get so busy because, remember last week we were talking about approval of people, and we're people pleasers, and so we say yes to a lot of different people because we're trying to seek approval and gain approval and make sure that everybody knows that we're a nice person. And so we say yes to everybody and everything, and then all of a sudden our lives are so busy that we feel completely out of control. We're not sure how we're going to get done what needs to get done, and we look at the toll that it takes on people around us, on our friends and on our family, and our lives are so busy that we feel out of control. In the same way as when we are controlled by other people and we start to feel squeezed, when our lives are out of control, we still feel squeezed. We're not sure what to do or where to go because we don't want to say no to people, but yet we end up with the burden on our lives because we're so busy. And again, back to this idea of religion. A lot of people, when they think about religion, that it's all about control, that it's about somebody else trying to control me, trying to control my life, that it's about somebody else modifying my behavior, that my behavior currently is not good enough, and so somebody else is going to give me a list of rules to follow and try to control me and make sure I do the right things, say the right things, wear the right things. And that if somebody else can control me through religion, I want to run the opposite direction. And so many people, that's their perception and that's their understanding. And maybe for some of you here in this space, in this room this morning, maybe when you think about the idea of religion or Christianity, you think about people who talk about God or Jesus, that it's all about somebody trying to control you with a list of rules, trying to modify your behavior, and really trying to keep you from enjoying life as you want to enjoy it. So we have all of these ways that we feel squeezed, that people are trying to control us, and it's soul crushing, it's soul killing. We have these ways that we live out of control because of the access and availability of our society these days, that we can pretty much do everything, so we say yes to everything. We can, so we do, and then all of a sudden we realize that just like corporate culture controlling us, when our lives are out of control, we actually experience less of life. We feel squeezed. We don't feel free. Being busy and doing more stuff doesn't really play out like we had hoped. And again, religion is oftentimes construed as just a way to control people, a list of rules to follow, a way that somebody else is trying to modify my behavior, or maybe I'm modifying my behavior because that's how I've understood it, and that's how it's been explained to me, and that's how I've been trained and reared. But yet, even in that, when I modify my behavior, I still don't experience more life through that. Instead, it's like squeezing and experiencing less of life, even when I think I'm doing the right things because that's what I've been told and that's how I've been reared. And so this morning we're going to take a look at the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the group of believers in Colossae. Apostle Paul, as you remember, he was a leader in the Jewish faith until he had an encounter, he had an experience of God, that he believed that Jesus came to him and spoke to him. And from that moment forward, Paul was on a completely different mission. He had a completely different worldview and understanding of who he is and what he was supposed to be doing. So instead of trying to stop the spread of this message of a man named Jesus, instead it became his life mission, was to spread this message. And so the Apostle Paul would write to these gathered groups of believers all over his area of the world, some of whom he had visited and who he knew personally, others whom he had sent people who he was apprenticing to oversee and to lead and to help. And then they would report back to Paul, and then he would write letters in response to these reports that he was getting. And that's what we see here in this city of Colossae. And it's handed down to us over thousands of years through a book in the New Testament of the Bible called Colossians. And Paul gives us what can be construed as some of those lists, some of those religious lists that people would want to use to control us or to modify our behavior. And he says, so put to death the parts of your life that belong to the earth, such as sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. And so he starts to list these behaviors. And we start to say, oh, here he goes again. It's another religious leader, another figure just giving us a list that we have to follow. And if we don't follow these things perfectly, they probably won't let us be a part of their club. And then I'll just go away feeling guilty. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And really, when you look at this list, sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed, Some of us experience life through these behaviors, at first anyway. Some of us think that this is what life is about. Some of us think that we can get ahead through these behaviors, or we can find fulfillment, or we can find success through these behaviors. And at first, a lot of them feel good as we enter into them, right? Or at least they should. If they don't feel good, you're not doing it right. At first. But then it's the aftertaste that for many people causes us to go back to the beginning, and back to the beginning, and back to the beginning, and they become rhythms and patterns of our lives because they feel good at first, but then they have an aftertaste, and then it's the aftertaste that drives us to go back to the beginning. And he continues, he gives us another list as we continue to read his letter. He says, "But now set aside these things, such as anger, rage, malice, slander, and obscene language." See there, I told you again, it's just a list of rules of what to do and what not to do. And that's really what religion is this list of rules. I'm supposed to follow these rules and I can check them off. So don't get angry, okay. Don't slander people, don't use bad language. Is that really what it's about, is this list of rules? And he gives us an instead of those things. Paul says, as God's choice. Now remember, these letters that Paul writes are a believer in Jesus written to a group of believers in Jesus. So as we read these books in the New Testament of the Bible, these are written by a believer to believers. So Paul's making some assumptions as he's writing these letters. Therefore, as God's choice, holy and loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And so if you're not a believer, or if you come into this space or you're viewing this message online and you don't have a belief in Jesus, first of all, I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that you're tuning in. I'd rather you be here than anywhere else in the world this morning. But Paul makes some assumptions here. And if you're not a believer, then you can construe what he's saying as, see, here's some more lists of rules. Just be nice, be good, talk kindly to one another. And so if we're not careful, we see all of these lists as lists of to-dos and not to-dos. And so as we look, Paul says, put to death. And what's he talking about when he says put to death? Put to death sexual immorality. Put to death moral corruption. Put to death lust. Put to death evil desire. Put to death greed in your life. He says, this is the list right here. Just put these things to death. And then he says to set aside some things. He says, set aside anger. What else does he say to set aside? Anybody know? Was anybody paying attention? Rage, malice, slander. Y'all know them all. I don't even know why you're here this morning. Y'all already know all this. Slander. What was the last one? Obscene language. And so here we have some lists. He gives us lists. And put these to death. Don't do these things. Set these things aside. And then he tells us what to do. Put on compassion. What else do we put on? Kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Heard it in the back. You waited for that one. Yeah, that's right. It's a good job. You're displaying it. You've clearly already put it on. And so we have this list that Paul gives us. What if it's our perspective? What if it's our perspective that's wrong? What if these are not lists of not to do and to do? What if instead this first list right here of what we are to put to death, what if these are conditions of our hearts under which we're controlled? What if these are conditions that control us and we don't even realize it? See, we think that Paul is giving us a list of rules in order to control us and to modify our behavior. But what if he's giving us a list of conditions that already control our hearts without us even realizing it? So it's not a stop doing. It's a these things control your heart whether you realize it or not. And so these are conditions that control us. And maybe this second list of what he tells us to set aside, maybe these are just expressions when our hearts are controlled by these conditions. So when our hearts are controlled by these conditions, these are the expressions of those conditions. So the people who are around us and the people who know us, and although we get defensive when it happens, this is how they know us. They know us by our anger and our rage and our malice and our slander and our gossip and our obscene language and the way that we speak about ourselves and the way that we speak about other people and the way that we talk about life. And so we have these conditions of the heart. We have expressions of those conditions. And then Paul gives us a list of different expressions. What would it be to be known by compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience? See, many people think that religion is minding your manners. Mind your manners. Mind your manners. Or mind the rules. If you would just mind. If you would just mind. And that feels like control. Right? If people they just want me to mind their rules, that just feels like somebody's trying to control me. And is that what religion is about, is just minding? And see, we have to go back to what Paul says earlier in his letter and then ultimately what he says later in his letter to understand that maybe these are conditions of the heart and not rules. So this is what Paul says at the beginning of this section. Therefore, if you were raised with Christ, again, believer to believer, he's making assumptions here, look for the things that are above where Christ is sitting at God's right side. And then he says, think about the things above and not things on earth. And there's another version that says, set your mind on things above. Set your mind on things above and not things on earth. You died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And so people think that religion is about minding. Maybe it's not about minding so much as it is setting your mind on things above. Maybe it's not following the rules. Maybe it's thinking about things other than what you see right in front of you, and to understand and to come to believe that there's something going on outside of what we see and what we hear and what we feel right now. And then as we continue to look later in this letter, Paul says, the peace of Christ must control your hearts. A peace into which you were called in one body, and be thankful people. The peace of Christ must control your hearts. When you feel like you're being controlled by a corporate culture and it's all about rules being handed down, it's the peace of Christ that must control your heart. When your life is so busy, you don't know if you're coming or going, you don't know what's next, and there is no app that is going to save you. There is no app that has the notification ability to fix it. And you feel out of control, it's the peace of Christ that must control your hearts. And when it comes to religion, it's about being under control, but not being under control according to rules and regulation and law, but it's about being under the control of the peace of Jesus Christ in your heart. See, these aren't matters of the mind. It's a heart issue. Following the rules is all about the mind, but it's really an issue of the heart. And so Paul says, set your mind on things above. Setting your mind on things above settles your heart in things below. Setting your mind on things above settles your heart in things below. And we need our hearts to be controlled by the peace of Christ and to be settled and to experience Him and to live into Him, into the life that He desires most for us. And so for some of you, to come into that peace that God desires for you is to come into a relationship for the very first time with this man, Jesus Christ. And you're thinking, I'm tired of the busyness. I'm tired of seeking approval from following the rules. I'm tired of being a people pleaser. And see, when it comes to the peace of Christ controlling our hearts, when we start to feel squeezed by the corporate culture that we experience in the day-to-day, when you're in your office and you get that new email or the manager comes by, or heaven help you, you are the manager, you understand that if your heart is controlled by the peace of Christ, that your identity is not in that culture. Your identity is not in that position. That you have a different identity through a relationship with Jesus Christ that is eternal and that is beyond anything that you see. And you set your mind on things above in that moment, and it settles your heart. Or when you're busy all the time and your life is out of control because you're a people pleaser, and the control of the peace of Christ takes over your heart, and your heart is then controlled by that peace, you realize, I don't have to please anybody. I don't have to please anybody, because the one who made me is already pleased with me. I don't have to say yes, and I don't have to run this rat race, and I don't have to stay as busy as I can to make other people happy, because the one who made me is already pleased with me. And when we set our mind on things above in that moment, it settles our hearts in the things below. And we see again how Jesus is greater than religion. Jesus is greater than the rules, greater than the regulation, greater than the control, greater than the behavior modification. And if we think back to those lists that Paul gives us, and we come with a new perspective, and we don't see them as things not to do. Instead, we see them as conditions of our hearts. Imagine what your life would be like if you were not controlled by those conditions. That if you were no longer held captive to those conditions that Paul sets out. That you had freedom from them. That if people didn't know you according to the expressions of those conditions of your heart. See, it's not about behavior modification. God doesn't want you to modify your behavior. God wants to heal your heart. God has no interest in you modifying your behavior for His sake. God wants to heal your heart from that condition that holds it captive. Then you put on the other expressions. When God has healed your heart, God wants to heal your heart. He wants you to live a life where the expression of your soul and your spirit is in the third list. Compassion, humility, gentleness, patience. And all of a sudden, that becomes an expression, not a to-do, not a way to live, not a way to try to convince others that you're a good person, but it becomes the expression of the condition of your heart that's been healed by Jesus and is now under the control of his peace. And for some of you, having a healed heart today means making a decision and saying yes to a Jesus who you weren't even sure that you believed in before this morning, and entering into that relationship with him. And for others, you've been in that relationship, but it's been rocky lately. It's been a rocky relationship. And Jesus is right there wanting to further heal, to continue to heal something new in your heart, and to control your heart with his peace. Can I pray for you this morning? Heavenly Father, help us to have a new perspective on who you are. Help us to have a greater self-awareness of the condition of our hearts. Lord, show us, reveal to us the ways in which you want to heal us. Lord, that when we are angry with people and expressing that anger, when we are slandering people, Lord, when we are ill-intentioned towards others in our lives, reveal to us in those moments, Lord, that it's the condition of our hearts that is expressing those words. And Lord, in those moments, heal our hearts through the power of your Spirit, Lord. May we seek you. May we set our mind on things above. May we enter into your presence in a new way in those moments and be healed by you. Lord, so that our lives can be expressions of compassion for people, of gentleness, humility, Lord, and patience as you control our hearts. Your peace reigns in our hearts. And Lord, I lift up those who may not have known you before this time this morning. I pray, Lord, that they would be strengthened by your Spirit, Lord, to make a decision to enter into that relationship with you, some of them for the very first time this morning. And God, we thank you so much, Lord, that the healing that we need, that we search for, that we yearn for, comes only from you. Thank you for pointing us to that healing this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks again for everybody for participating in the collection for Bright Blessings. We're so excited the way that that's going to bless the community through that awesome organization. Y'all have a great week. We'll see you next week.